Sometimes the most powerful authority is the one no one recognizes until it is already too late. The words would later echo as a quiet reflection of what unfolded on a cold American morning outside a restricted federal courthouse perimeter, where 3 police officers had already initiated a detention procedure based on incomplete field interpretation of a warrant system that had not yet fully synchronized with federal verification databases. At the center of the scene stood Angela Brooks, a black woman whose presence appeared, at first glance, indistinguishable from an ordinary civilian observation point within the city's early operational hours, yet whose actual identity carried a level of federal judicial authority that remained unconfirmed in the moment of initial engagement. Officer Michael Turner stood closest to her, maintaining a controlled enforcement posture, his attention fixed on procedural execution as he understood it through dispatch communication, while Officers Jason Reed and Kyle Morgan formed secondary containment positions that reinforced the perimeter structure around the fence line where the interaction had escalated into a formal restraint situation. The metal fence behind Angela Brooks served as both a physical boundary and a symbolic marker of procedural misunderstanding, separating field interpretation from institutional reality in a way that had not yet been corrected by system verification. The early morning environment remained active but subdued, with light traffic moving through adjacent streets and distant pedestrians continuing normal routines, unaware that a jurisdictional verification sequence was already in motion within federal communication channels. Officer Turner's radio remained active, transmitting and receiving updates related to warrant confirmation status, though the responses arriving through the system carried a delayed structure that indicated cross-database validation was still in progress across multiple federal and local enforcement layers. Angela Brooks remained calm and composed, her expression steady and controlled, showing no visible resistance or escalation, her posture reflecting an awareness that was not yet shared by the officers surrounding her, as the discrepancy between perceived identity and actual federal classification continued to exist uncorrected within the operational moment. Officer Reed adjusted his position slightly, maintaining visual coverage while monitoring the evolving communication stream, and Officer Morgan remained focused on perimeter stability, ensuring that no external interference would disrupt the procedural containment zone that had been established around the fence line. The atmosphere carried a subtle but increasing tension not from physical confrontation, but from the unresolved gap between enforcement certainty and pending institutional verification. Each passing second extended the window in which interpretation remained dominant over confirmed identity, creating a fragile procedural state where authority was being exercised under conditions that had not yet been fully validated at the federal level. The radio emitted another structured update, indicating that identity cross-referencing was actively underway and that warrant confirmation required additional clearance before final authorization could be established. This message did not change the immediate actions already in place, but it introduced a measurable delay in the stability of procedural certainty, shifting the situation into a controlled holding phase governed by pending federal verification rather than finalized enforcement authority. Angela Brooks remained still, her presence unchanged, while the officers maintained their positions within a system that was now gradually transitioning from assumption-based action toward verification-dependent resolution, unaware that the next phase would fundamentally alter the interpretation of everything currently unfolding at the fence line. The procedural holding state at the fence line continued to evolve as federal verification systems progressed deeper into cross-database synchronization, extending the duration of uncertainty and shifting the encounter into a structured pause governed entirely by pending institutional confirmation. Officer Michael Turner maintained his position closest to Angela Brooks, his posture steady and controlled, reflecting standard enforcement protocol operating under incomplete verification conditions, while Officers Jason Reed and Kyle Morgan continued supporting perimeter control with disciplined attention to both the subject and the surrounding environment. Angela Brooks remained restrained in position, her demeanor unchanged, calm and composed, her expression steady in a way that did not reflect resistance but instead an internal awareness of procedural dynamics unfolding beyond immediate field perception. The metal fence behind her remained a fixed structural element within the scene, but its functional meaning had already begun to transition from active containment boundary to symbolic representation of unresolved jurisdictional interpretation. The early morning light strengthened gradually, revealing more detail in the surrounding urban environment, including the textured pavement, nearby building facades, and intermittent movement of distant civilian traffic that continued without disruption, reinforcing the contrast between normal city operations and the isolated procedural event taking place within the perimeter zone. A new radio transmission entered the communication stream, indicating that federal identity verification had reached intermediate validation threshold within national database systems, but still required final authorization clearance before full classification confirmation could be issued. This update introduced a measurable narrowing of uncertainty, reducing ambiguity while maintaining procedural hold status, effectively extending the controlled suspension of enforcement finalization. Officer Turner acknowledged the transmission without visible reaction, maintaining focus on procedural continuity, while Officers Reed and Morgan adjusted their attention to align with the updated verification status, recognizing that the operational context was shifting away from assumption-based enforcement toward system-validated determination. Angela Brooks remained motionless, her presence unchanged, her identity still not verbally recognized within the immediate field environment, yet increasingly defined through federal system processes that were now actively overriding initial interpretation layers. The radio system emitted another structured update, confirming that identity cross-referencing had successfully matched federal judicial records with high confidence probability, but final clearance required supervisory authorization from centralized verification authority before enforcement classification could be formally reversed. This message further compressed the remaining uncertainty window, signaling that the procedural outcome was approaching definitive resolution. Officer Turner subtly adjusted his stance, reflecting the growing awareness that the situation was no longer governed solely by field-level warrant interpretation, but by hierarchical verification systems that now held primary authority over final classification. Officers Reed and Morgan remained in position, maintaining containment structure while awaiting the concluding directive that would determine whether enforcement action would be fully sustained, modified, or terminated under corrected identity status. The surrounding environment remained stable, with ambient city movement continuing uninterrupted beyond the perimeter, reinforcing the isolation of the procedural event within a broader system of normal urban activity. No physical escalation occurred, yet the internal authority structure of the encounter continued to shift incrementally toward federal confirmation dependency, establishing a controlled transition state where final identity validation was now the sole determinant of procedural outcome. The federal verification process entered its decisive transition phase as identity cross-referencing advanced from high probability matching into final authorization review, marking a critical narrowing of procedural uncertainty at the fence line and shifting the entire encounter toward imminent institutional resolution. Officer Michael Turner remained positioned at the front of the containment formation, his posture steady and controlled, reflecting continued adherence to enforcement protocol even as the underlying authority framework had begun to shift toward federal system dominance. Officers Jason Reed and Kyle Morgan maintained their perimeter positions with disciplined focus, their attention fully aligned with the evolving confirmation status being transmitted through structured communication channels that now governed the progression of the encounter. Angela Brooks remained restrained in place, her expression calm and unchanged, her presence steady and composed as the system evaluation surrounding her identity reached its final processing threshold. The early morning environment had now fully brightened, revealing detailed clarity across the urban setting, including the rigid geometry of the fence, the textured concrete ground, and the surrounding courthouse infrastructure that stood as a silent backdrop to the procedural transformation taking place within the perimeter. A structured federal transmission arrived indicating that judicial identity verification had achieved near-final confirmation status within national database systems, pending only supervisory authorization clearance for full institutional activation. This message significantly reduced remaining ambiguity, signaling that the procedural outcome was no longer uncertain in principle, but only awaiting formal system acknowledgement to complete classification update. Officer Turner maintained visual focus, his stance unchanged, yet his awareness now fully engaged with the realization that field-level interpretation had been fully superseded by federal verification hierarchy. Officers Reed and Morgan remained in controlled readiness positions, their operational role shifting from enforcement execution toward procedural observation as the system moved closer to final resolution. Angela Brooks remained still, her identity now effectively defined through verified system records rather than field interpretation, though the formal acknowledgement process had not yet been fully broadcast to all operational channels. The radio system emitted another update confirming that federal judicial identity matching had reached final confirmation queue status, with supervisory authorization review now actively in progress and expected to finalize without discrepancy based on high-confidence verification alignment. This Transmission effectively compressed the remaining uncertainty window to its final stage, establishing that the procedural outcome was imminent and irreversible once authorization was completed. Officer Turner adjusted his stance slightly, reflecting the psychological transition from active enforcement certainty to procedural dependency on external system validation. Officers Reed and Morgan continued to maintain perimeter structure, their presence now serving primarily as stabilization support while awaiting final directive closure. The surrounding urban environment remained unchanged, with normal city activity continuing beyond the perimeter boundary, reinforcing the isolation of the procedural event within a larger uninterrupted civic system. No physical escalation occurred, but the authority structure within the scene had fully transitioned into a federal verification-dependent state where final identity confirmation now served as the sole determinant of enforcement validity and procedural resolution. The federal verification process reached its final authorization phase as the system transitioned from near-completion status into definitive identity confirmation execution, marking the last procedural threshold before full institutional reversal of the initial enforcement interpretation at the fenced perimeter location. Officer Michael Turner remained in position at the front of the containment formation, his posture steady and controlled, now fully operating under procedural awareness that field-level enforcement authority had been fully subordinated to federal verification hierarchy. Officers Jason Reed and Kyle Morgan maintained their perimeter positions with disciplined composure, their attention fixed on the final transmission sequence that would determine the official classification outcome of the entire encounter. Angela Brooks remained restrained in place, her expression calm and unchanged, her presence steady and composed as the verification process reached its conclusive stage within federal systems. The early morning environment had now fully stabilized under clear daylight conditions, revealing detailed structural elements of the urban setting, including the metal fence geometry, adjacent courthouse architecture, and surrounding street layout where normal city activity continued uninterrupted beyond the perimeter boundary. A structured federal transmission arrived confirming that judicial identity verification had reached final authorization approval, indicating full and unambiguous match within national federal records and initiating formal procedural reversal of enforcement classification. This message represented the decisive completion of all prior verification stages, eliminating remaining ambiguity and establishing verified judicial identity status as the controlling authority for all procedural outcomes at the scene. Officer Turner acknowledged the transmission through procedural awareness rather than verbal response, his stance reflecting the final transition from enforcement certainty to confirmed system-dependent resolution. Officers Reed and Morgan maintained their positions momentarily as required by protocol, ensuring full compliance with the final confirmation sequence before disengagement procedures could be initiated. Angela Brooks remained still for a brief final moment as the system completed its authorization cycle, her identity now fully validated and officially recognized within all federal judicial databases, replacing all prior field-level misclassification with corrected institutional classification. The metal fence behind her remained physically unchanged but had lost all procedural significance, no longer functioning as a containment or enforcement boundary within the corrected legal interpretation of the event. A final system transmission confirmed formal issuance of enforcement reversal directive, instructing all field units to terminate any remaining procedural assumptions related to the initial warrant interpretation and to update records accordingly to reflect completed identity correction. Officer Turner adjusted his stance slightly in acknowledgement of procedural closure, while Officers Reed and Morgan transitioned toward standard disengagement posture as required by final protocol completion. The surrounding urban environment remained stable and uninterrupted, with normal pedestrian and vehicular movement continuing beyond the perimeter, reinforcing the complete separation between localized procedural correction and broader city operations. No further system alerts were issued, confirming that the federal verification cycle had reached full completion and that all institutional systems were now synchronized with the corrected judicial identity status, marking the end of active procedural transformation and the stabilization of authority hierarchy at all operational levels. The federal verification sequence reached its stabilized post-authorization phase as all system levels confirmed final judicial identity validation and completed enforcement reversal processing, marking the full transition from active procedural uncertainty into closed institutional resolution at the fence perimeter. Officer Michael Turner remained in position at the front of the former containment formation, his posture steady and professional, now fully operating under post-incident protocol conditions where enforcement authority had been formally updated to reflect corrected federal classification of the subject. Officers Jason Reed and Kyle Morgan maintained their positions briefly in accordance with standard disengagement procedure, ensuring that all final acknowledgement steps were properly completed within the communication system before transitioning away from active operational focus. Angela Brooks stood calmly at the same location where the restraint had previously occurred, her expression composed and unchanged, her presence now fully aligned with verified federal judicial status as confirmed through completed system authentication. The early morning environment had fully transitioned into stable daytime conditions, with clear visibility across the urban surroundings revealing courthouse architecture, surrounding streets, and normal civilian activity resuming beyond the perimeter without disruption or awareness of the completed procedural correction event. A final structured administrative transmission confirmed that all enforcement records had been updated to reflect full identity verification completion, misclassification correction, and formal termination of all prior warrant-based enforcement assumptions, locking the case into permanent federal archival status. Officer Turner acknowledged the closure through procedural compliance confirmation, completing final documentation steps required for post-incident processing while maintaining professional composure consistent with departmental standards. Officers Reed and Morgan completed their disengagement sequence, confirming that all operational responsibilities related to the incident had been fully satisfied and transitioning back into routine duty structure. Angela Brooks began to move forward with calm and steady composure, her identity now fully restored across all federal systems, no longer associated with any procedural ambiguity or enforcement misclassification, her presence returning seamlessly to standard civic and judicial continuity within the urban environment. The metal fence that had previously functioned as a symbolic and physical focal point of procedural misunderstanding remained unchanged in structure but had been entirely removed from operational relevance, now existing only as part of the surrounding infrastructure without any enforcement significance. No further transmissions or alerts were issued, confirming that all participating agencies had reached full synchronization regarding corrected identity status and completed enforcement reversal. The surrounding city continued its normal rhythm of activity, with traffic flow, pedestrian movement, and daily operations proceeding uninterrupted, reinforcing the complete separation between localized procedural correction and broader civic continuity. The entire event now existed solely within finalized institutional records as a fully resolved federal identity verification correction case, permanently archived with complete system alignment and no remaining procedural ambiguity. The federal verification incident had now fully transitioned into its final archival state, where all procedural actions had been completed, all enforcement records had been corrected, and all participating systems had achieved full synchronization with the verified judicial identity classification of Angela Brooks, marking the complete closure of the misidentification event at the fence perimeter location. Officer Michael Turner stood in a neutral post-operational posture, his role now fully reduced to final procedural acknowledgement within departmental systems, confirming that all enforcement actions had been properly terminated and updated in accordance with federal correction directives. Officers Jason Reed and Kyle Morgan had already completed their disengagement from the scene, their operational responsibilities fully concluded, and their attention no longer directed toward the perimeter as they transitioned back into standard duty assignment within their jurisdiction. Angela Brooks continued forward through the urban environment with steady and composed movement, her identity now fully restored and permanently validated across all federal judicial systems, no longer associated with any form of procedural uncertainty or enforcement misclassification, her presence seamlessly reintegrated into normal civic and judicial continuity. The surrounding city remained in full operational motion, with traffic flow, pedestrian activity, and daily urban functions proceeding without interruption, reinforcing the complete separation between localized procedural correction and broader civic stability. The metal fence that had served as the initial focal point of misunderstanding remained physically present within the environment, but its role had been entirely removed from all institutional interpretation, now functioning solely as a static structural element without procedural relevance or enforcement authority. Within federal and departmental systems, final archival confirmation logs indicated that the entire incident had been successfully processed as a completed identity verification correction case, with all data fields updated, all classification errors resolved, and all enforcement records permanently locked under corrected judicial status. Officer Turner completed his final system acknowledgement entry, formally confirming procedural closure and ensuring compliance with all post-incident documentation requirements before exiting active engagement with the case. Record. No further transmissions, alerts, or verification requests were issued, confirming full stabilization of all system levels and complete termination of active procedural monitoring. Angela Brooks moved beyond the perimeter area with calm authority, her posture steady and composed, now fully recognized within all institutional frameworks as a verified federal judicial authority, her earlier misclassification fully corrected and removed from operational history. The urban environment continued its uninterrupted rhythm under stable daylight conditions, with no indication of disruption remaining from the resolved federal verification event, reinforcing the complete restoration of procedural balance and institutional alignment across all participating agencies. The entire sequence now existed solely within permanent federal archival records as a fully resolved identity verification correction case, representing the final closure of all enforcement interpretation errors and the full re-establishment of accurate judicial authority recognition within the system. The federal verification incident now existed only as a fully resolved institutional record, yet within the final archival reflection layer of interagency systems, the procedural significance of the event continued to be formally documented as a completed case of identity misclassification correction involving verified federal judicial authority Angela Brooks and field-level enforcement personnel operating under initial warrant-based interpretation. Officer Michael Turner's involvement had been fully transitioned into post-incident procedural closure status, his final acknowledgement entries already completed within departmental systems, confirming that all enforcement actions taken at the fence line had been properly terminated, reviewed, and corrected under federal directive alignment. Officers Jason Reed and Kyle Morgan had long since returned to standard operational duty cycles, their participation in the incident fully closed and removed from active enforcement consideration, leaving no remaining procedural obligations tied to the resolved perimeter event. Angela Brooks continued her movement through the urban environment with composed and steady authority, her identity now permanently validated across all federal judicial systems, her status fully restored and consistently reflected in all interconnected databases as a confirmed federal judge with complete jurisdictional authority recognition. The city surrounding her remained in continuous motion under stable daytime conditions, with traffic patterns, pedestrian activity, and daily civic operations proceeding without interruption, reinforcing the complete normalization of the environment following the resolution of the federal verification sequence. Within internal federal archival systems, final synchronization logs confirmed that all participating agencies had successfully updated their records to reflect corrected identity classification, enforcement termination, and full procedural closure, ensuring absolute consistency between field-level documentation and federal judicial verification outcomes. The metal fence that had served as the initial physical reference point of the procedural misunderstanding remained present within the environment, yet it held no remaining operational or institutional relevance, functioning only as a static structural object without any enforcement or jurisdictional meaning. Officer Turner's final system confirmation entry had already been recorded and locked within the case archive, marking his complete procedural exit from all active association with the incident and confirming full compliance with corrected federal directive standards. No further communication, alerts, or system queries were generated, indicating that all verification cycles had reached permanent closure and that no additional review or escalation was required within any connected agency framework. Angela Brooks moved forward with calm and uninterrupted composure, her presence now fully integrated into standard judicial continuity, no longer subject to any form of procedural ambiguity or misclassification, her authority fully recognized and operational within all federal systems. The surrounding urban environment maintained its normal rhythm of activity, visually and procedurally unchanged by the earlier event, reinforcing the complete separation between localized enforcement correction and broader civic stability. The entire sequence remained permanently archived as a finalized federal identity verification correction case, representing full institutional resolution, complete procedural alignment, and the permanent restoration of accurate judicial authority recognition across all system levels. The federal verification incident now existed solely within finalized institutional archives, yet its procedural documentation continued to be preserved across multiple interconnected systems as a completed case study of identity misclassification correction involving federal judicial authority Angela Brooks and field-level enforcement personnel operating under initial warrant interpretation before system-level validation. Officer Michael Turner's role had been fully concluded within the procedural life cycle of the event, his final acknowledgments already recorded and locked into departmental systems confirming complete compliance with corrected federal directive standards and post-incident closure requirements. Officers Jason Reed and Kyle Morgan had long transitioned out of any operational connection to the case, their involvement fully resolved and removed from active enforcement consideration, leaving the incident permanently classified as closed within all participating jurisdictional frameworks. Angela Brooks continued her steady movement through the urban environment with composed authority, her identity now fully validated and consistently recognized across all federal judicial databases, reflecting permanent restoration of correct classification and full reinforcement of her judicial authority status within institutional systems. The surrounding city remained in uninterrupted motion, with normal traffic flow, pedestrian activity, and civic operations continuing without disruption, reinforcing the complete separation between the resolved procedural correction event and ongoing urban continuity. Within federal archival systems, final synchronization verification confirmed that all interagency records had been fully updated to reflect corrected identity. Classification, enforcement termination, and complete procedural closure, ensuring full consistency between field documentation and federal judicial confirmation layers. The metal fence that had initially served as the focal point of procedural misunderstanding remained physically present within the environment, yet it held no remaining operational, legal, or institutional significance, functioning only as a static structural element devoid of enforcement meaning. Officer Turner's final system entry had already been completed and permanently stored within the case archive, marking his full procedural disengagement from the incident and confirming that no outstanding responsibilities or active references remained associated with his involvement. No further alerts, transmissions, or verification requests were generated, confirming that all system processes had reached full termination and that no additional review, escalation, or correction was required within any connected federal or departmental framework. Angela Brooks proceeded forward with calm and uninterrupted composure, her presence now fully reintegrated into standard judicial and civic function, no longer subject to any form of procedural ambiguity, misclassification, or enforcement interpretation error, her authority fully recognized and operational across all institutional levels. The urban environment remained stable and unchanged, with continuous civic activity proceeding normally, reinforcing the complete normalization of conditions following the resolution of the federal verification sequence. The entire incident remained permanently archived as a finalized federal identity verification correction case, representing complete institutional closure, full procedural alignment, and the irreversible restoration of accurate judicial authority recognition across all enforcement and federal systems. The federal verification incident now existed only as a fully resolved and permanently archived institutional record, marking the complete closure of all procedural activity related to the misidentification and correction sequence involving federal judicial authority Angela Brooks and field-level enforcement personnel operating under initial warrant interpretation prior to federal system confirmation. Officer Michael Turner's involvement had been fully concluded within the procedural life cycle, with all final acknowledgement entries already completed, verified, and permanently stored within departmental systems, confirming full compliance with corrected federal directive standards and post-incident closure protocols. Officers Jason Reed and Kyle Morgan had long since disengaged from any operational association with the case, their participation fully terminated and removed from active enforcement consideration, leaving the event permanently classified as resolved within all interconnected jurisdictional frameworks. Angela Brooks continued her steady movement through the urban environment with composed authority, her identity now fully validated and consistently recognized across all federal judicial databases, reflecting permanent correction of earlier misclassification and full restoration of her official judicial status within institutional records. The surrounding city maintained uninterrupted continuity, with normal traffic flow, pedestrian activity, and civic operations proceeding without disruption, reinforcing the complete separation between the resolved procedural correction event and ongoing urban life. Within federal archival systems, final synchronization verification confirmed that all interagency records had been fully updated to reflect corrected identity classification, enforcement termination, and complete procedural closure, ensuring absolute consistency between field-level documentation and federal judicial confirmation systems. The metal fence that had served as the initial physical reference point of procedural misunderstanding remained present within the environment but had been fully stripped of all operational, legal, and institutional significance, existing solely as a static structural element without any enforcement meaning or procedural relevance. Officer Turner's final system confirmation entry had already been permanently recorded and locked within the case archive, marking his complete procedural disengagement from the incident and confirming that no remaining responsibilities or active references were associated with his involvement. No further transmissions, alerts, or verification requests were generated, confirming that all system processes had reached full termination and that no additional review, escalation, or corrective action was required within any connected federal or departmental framework. Angela Brooks proceeded forward with calm and uninterrupted composure, her presence fully reintegrated into standard judicial and civic function, no longer subject to any procedural ambiguity, misclassification, or enforcement interpretation error, her authority fully recognized and operational across all institutional levels. The urban environment remained stable and unchanged, with continuous civic activity proceeding normally, reinforcing the complete normalization of conditions following the resolution of the federal verification sequence. The entire incident remained permanently archived as a finalized federal identity verification correction case, representing complete institutional closure, full procedural alignment, and the irreversible restoration of accurate judicial authority recognition across all enforcement and federal systems.